You might notice that Capcom's earlier arcade ports on the NES are generally low quality. They all have the same things in common: poor frame rate, terrible graphics, and gameplay that's worse than their arcade versions. But it wasn't actually Capcom that developed these ports. Let's take a look at the company that's really behind these games. What's going on? It's Podrez coming at you with another video. We're going to be talking about the developer Micronics today. If that sounds like fun to you, hit that subscribe button right there. We're on the way to 50,000 subscribers, and only you can help me get there. We also have an amazing Discord community. Just go to our server, discord.podrez.net. Alright, we're going to get started. When you look at any game, you see the company name listed, whether it's on the box, cartridge, or in the copyright info. You might automatically assume they developed the game. For example, I see Hudson on the box of Adventure Island 2. That must mean they developed it, right? That's not always the case. The Nintendo Famicom gained a ton of third-party support, and many companies wanted to port over their arcade games. They could either do it themselves or hire someone like Micronics. Micronics was a developer that did contract work for publishers. They were paid for their work, but the publisher took all the credit for their games. For example, Elevator Action on the NES was developed by Micronics, but you don't see their name listed anywhere on the box or cartridge. You do see the publisher, Taito, all over it though. The arcade version, on the other hand, was developed by Taito. You play as a secret agent who must collect all the documents in the building. Thankfully, your work was made easier because all the secret documents are only inside red doors. How convenient. You control the elevators when you're inside, but they move on their own when you're not. You can shoot enemies with your gun, but you die in one hit. The NES version happens to be Micronics' first game. The arcade experience was captured quite well, with the controls and mechanics being exactly the same. Speaking of controls, my only complaint about this game is how difficult it is to enter doors and use escalators. I usually have to try more than once. When you duck, you're locked in that position until you press up, which is unusual. The frame rate is also not great, which is a trend you're going to see in many Micronics games. To be fair though, all of these issues were also present in the arcade version. Micronics was only hired to port over the arcade game, not improve it. For being their first project, Micronics did a great job with this game. Micronics did develop some Japanese exclusives. Here's Geimos, which was published by ASCII. It's a rail shooter that's inspired by Space Harrier. You can shoot directly in front of you, but you also have missiles that can destroy the grounded enemies. You fight the same boss at the end of every stage, but if you don't defeat them in time, you have to redo the stage. The graphics are very well done. I love the 3D animated background and the amount of detail. You can also play Mode B, where the camera is focused on your ship instead of a fixed position. My biggest complaint is the perspective. Sometimes it's hard to tell where the red bullets are, especially when fighting the boss. You also don't get a lot of content. There's only a few stage backgrounds, and then it repeats. I'm not going to complain about it too much though, because it's a 40 kilobyte game and it was released in 1985. Micronics didn't only work with Taito or ASCII. Capcom hired them to port over some of their arcade games, some of which you've probably played. 1942 was originally an arcade game by Capcom. It's an early horizontal shooter. You die in one hit, but you can perform rolls that make you invulnerable to enemies. You can only roll a temporary amount of times though. There's various power-ups you can collect, like this one, which gives you more firepower. The game is challenging because of the one-hit deaths and unpredictable enemy patterns. These larger aircraft should be destroyed immediately because they fire off spread shots, which can be hard to avoid. The game is a little too basic for shoot-'em-up standards, but that's understandable because of when it was released, 1984. It seems like the NES version would be able to handle a game like this with no problem, right? Okay, I'm gonna try to be as positive as I can. Micronics did capture the arcade experience for the most part. The stages are similar, the power-ups are the same, and the controls feel like the arcade original. But I do have to acknowledge the elephant in the room. The game looks like crap. The graphics are far worse, there's more flickering, and the frame rate looks terrible. Honestly, this could pass for an unlicensed game. For some reason, the boss is completely stationary while the screen moves up and down. It's common for developers to use background tiles for bosses, but why not make everything around it a solid color to give the illusion of the aircraft moving? Anyway, it's playable, but could have been better if it were developed by somebody else. Ghosts and Goblins was another arcade game that would later receive an NES port. It's a basic platformer where you have to reach the end and fight a boss. The game is notoriously difficult. You can only take 2 hits before you die, and you can't control your direction while in the air. Because of the colorful graphics and multi-directional scrolling, I imagine this would be difficult to port over to the NES. Against all odds though, Micronics made it happen. I'm really nervous to see how this one turned out. The gameplay is actually pretty close to the arcade version. All the levels are here, and the controls feel exactly the same. Surprisingly, the game scrolls in multiple directions, which is uncommon in early NES games. In general, I do find this one a little more impressive than 1942, but there's still some obvious issues. The graphics took a significant downgrade with far less colors and smaller sprites. The frame rate, once again, is very poor. All things considered, it's an acceptable port, but had it been released 3 years later, it would have turned out much better. Here's the arcade version of SonSon. It's a cross between a platformer and a shooter. You can migrate between any platform by jumping up or down. The game can be challenging because you can only jump straight up and there's holes in some of the platforms. The enemies can also jump between platforms, which means they can intercept you. It's a simple concept, but a decent game. Once again, Capcom commissioned Micronics to develop the Famicom version. Unlike the previous 2 games, this one only came out in Japan. It's the same game, but with massive flickering and slowdown. When there's no enemies on the screen, the game is quite fast, but it slows down to a crawl when there's a lot going on. Even the introduction has some flickering, which is pathetic. The frame rate is also bad, like expected from Micronics. The game is actually a bit easier than the arcade version because the slowdown gives you more time to react. Outside of that, the gameplay is nearly identical to the arcade original. I'm not sure why Capcom hired Micronics for so many projects. Were they really that impressed with their work? But I do have to be fair that these were all early NES games before mappers were popular. Sometimes a publisher might originally hire one company to develop a series of games, but then decide to hire a different one later on. The original Ninja-Kun on the NES was published by Jaleco, but they decided to hire Toze to develop it. The game inspired the Ninja Jaja Maru-kun series, which were all developed by Jaleco in-house, but the official sequel to the original Ninja-Kun was actually developed by Micronics. Interesting that Jaleco decided to switch companies. Maybe it was cheaper. You play as a stubby red ninja, and it's a basic platformer. You start off with a shuriken, but every few stages you earn a new weapon. You die in 1 hit, but only from projectiles. It's one of the few games where touching an enemy doesn't hurt you. The most difficult aspect of the game is the limited controls. You can't change your direction mid-air, which means you can't move out of the way. You can only shoot directly in front or at an angle if you have the bomb weapon. There is a fire weapon, which is super nice, but it's only temporary. You can wall jump, but it's super delayed and awkward. The game was originally in the arcade, and all the issues I just mentioned are in that one too, so Micronics does get a pass. Unfortunately though, like with all of Micronics games, the frame rate is terrible and there's tons of slowdown. To be fair, some levels do get a ton of enemies, so I don't see how the NES would have gotten around this. Overall, it is an okay port of the arcade original. I do wonder how it would have turned out under Toze or Jaleco though. Another company that Micronics worked with was SNK. Here's Ikari Warriors. It's a run-and-gun game. You start off with a temporary amount of ammo and grenades that you can use throughout the stages. You can ride tanks, which have their own life bar, so it's always encouraged to take them if you see them. The controls could be better. Your character will always face the same direction if you use the joystick. Instead, you have separate buttons that will let you rotate. I find it difficult to rotate your character in time to hit the enemy that you want. Why not just point the joystick in the direction you want to shoot? The game is also unforgiving. You die in 1 hit, and you always start at the beginning of the stage if you lose all your lives, even if you choose to continue. It's not my favorite arcade game, but it's alright. Let's see what Micronics came up with. There's a few minor differences. Instead of pressing a separate button to rotate, you can now just point in the direction you want to shoot. If you lose all your lives, you can press ABBA to continue because the winner takes it all. As expected, the frame rate is terrible and the graphics took a massive downgrade. At this point, I expect it. The controls are more delayed than you might think. It takes a while for your character to shoot in the direction you want. If it controlled like the top-down stages in Super C, it would have been better. When you're in the tank, you can only shoot upwards and there's no way to get out when it's about to explode. This is the first port I've seen by Micronics where there's some noticeable gameplay differences from the arcade version. Overall, I like the controls better, but the arcade version is superior otherwise. So these are just a few of the games they developed. We can see a lot of the same issues between all of them: poor frame rate, tons of flickering, extreme slowdown, and severely downgraded graphics. I would have never have thought Elevator Action was made by the same developers as 1942, but that's absolutely the case. But to give credit where credit is due, the gameplay is nearly identical to their arcade counterparts. No major gameplay elements were sacrificed to make it possible on the NES. For example, Ghosts 'n Goblins still has every stage and retains multi-directional scrolling. That might have not been the case under a different developer. Going back to Capcom, their first 3 published games on the NES were all created by Micronics, but they would start developing games in-house starting with Commando. From here, we would see an improvement in quality. The sequel to 1942 was developed by Capcom, and this one turned out way better than Micronics' game. But why didn't Capcom develop their own games right from the start? There's a few possibilities. Sometimes it was cheaper, easier, or quicker to hire someone else. If a publisher was in a bind and desperately needed a game, a developer like Micronics could make it happen. In the case of Capcom, with the Famicom being new, maybe they didn't have the time or experience to develop games on that console yet, so they decided to hire someone that did. The only disadvantage is that you might get games like 1942 on the NES. If you made it this far in the video, hit that subscribe button right there. And what is your experience with Capcom's early NES games? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.